I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, and in a way, discussing London. Well, London's relations with the European Union, in which we sat for more than 40 years, but are soon to depart. And of course, a bit of what that will mean for British foreign policy and indeed international relations as a whole. It's a good time to be discussing this because the hour is late and Britain will finally depart, in every sense, the European Union in just a few months' time. And if it were not for the coronavirus crisis, suddenly much worse in Britain than it seemed to be drifting towards, and the accompanying economic problems that that has brought, this would be a very big subject indeed. And by the time you see this, I predict it will be. I'm joined, as always, by an audience of three because of the coronavirus restrictions, but they are a distinguished group indeed. I've seldom assembled a more distinguished group of academics and experts than we have today. Let me start with you, Professor Alan Sked, British academic and politician, Professor Emeritus of International History at the London School of Economics. He is the father of Brexit. He is the man who founded the United Kingdom Independence Party, whose final triumph came after they had ceased to be a serious force themselves. But if not for Professor Alan Sked, I doubt if we would be leaving the European Union at all. I hope that introduction doesn't offend you in any way. I think you've made a big mark on history with that. But now that you see the chaos that surrounds the actual exiting as we race towards it, any regrets?
No regrets whatsoever. I'm looking forward to the final exit with or without a free trade treaty. And it will enable us to resume what I think is our normal place in the world as an independent sovereign state with a democracy, an accountable government, a government which is accountable solely to the British people, who can get rid of that government if they don't like it. And this government will then go on. It's already signed up one free trade treaty with Japan. It will establish free trade with other countries around the world, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, America. And we will go on playing our part in international affairs as a member of NATO, on the Security Council of the United Nations. And we will have considerable influence, I think, whereas Europe, which I don't think has any influence in international affairs because it doesn't have an army, it's always split. On major foreign policy issues, it goes 6 or 7 different ways. In the Middle East, I don't think anybody pays any attention to what the European Union thinks. Israel certainly doesn't. And I don't see where its influence is. It's in hoc to Russia for energy. And its major state, Germany, is pacifist, doesn't like to contribute anything towards defense. Opinion polls show that Germans would not fight for the Baltic
Thank God
states.
for that. Haven't they done enough?
Well, for the Baltic states, Poland or Ukraine, if Russia invaded these states. And I think Angela Merkel doesn't really care about anything else except exports. When she's in China, she talks about exports. She won't bring up human rights, for example. And I don't see Europe doing very much in international affairs, but I do think Britain will resume a role of some influence, yes.
Why do you think the European Union never did assemble a kind of weight in international relations commensurate with its economic weight and its cultural weight?
Well, it didn't have any institutional basis for foreign affairs until relatively recently. Up until the beginning of this century, it didn't actually do very much economically. Its budgets were quite small, and all its budget was there for, up until the beginning of this century, was to pay for the bureaucracy, pay for the agricultural policy and the fisheries policy. Then they suddenly got into policy for monetary union, which turned out to be a disaster, and led to all sorts of crises and bailouts. And its growth rate, since the euro was introduced, has been just over half of the British one. So if you take the figures from 2000 to 2017, the UK economy has grown by about 46%, the European one by about 24%. Italy's grown by about 3 to 6%. It's stagnated altogether. It hasn't grown at all. So the more it does, the less successful it is. And now it's in a bind because France is trying to force Germany into a federal union, which the German people don't want. I don't think Merkel wants. But she's trying to keep Macron happy to a certain extent by fudging some sort of COVID reconstruction fund. And meanwhile, the European Central Bank is trying to solve the economic problems of Italy and Spain and elsewhere by a large program of quantitative easing. And that's got into trouble with the German Supreme Court. The whole thing's a bit of a mess. And it doesn't look to me as if the European Union has any clear road to any clear future.
Professor Rodney Shakespeare is an author and economist from Cambridge and also a qualified UK barrister, which tees me up perfectly, Professor, to ask about the legal implications of the British government's recent pronouncement that it was officially prepared to break international law in regard to the agreement that it had made with the European Union. This has caused an immense fluttering in the dovecote in Europe and amongst the Remainer elite in Britain, which hasn't given up hope of stopping Brexit. What's your view as both an economist and a significant lawyer of this new development?
Well, it's about the good and the long-term political name of the UK more than anything else. Good relations and trustworthiness for a country, it takes a long time to build up, and you can just throw it out window just like that, just as the same way as Trump is doing that in America. Could I briefly comment on what Alan said earlier?
Of course.
I think he's taking a bit of a rosy view as to what will be the situation when we leave officially. Look at the background before the virus. And what you've got there, you had debt levels higher, personal, corporation, country, higher than in 2007 and 2008. You've got a rich-poor division in country after country has increased. You've got a retraction, a shrinking of the middle classes in country after country. And you've got this technological shift, which is smashing out more traditional secure jobs and replacing them, if at all, with temporary, part-time, 0 hours, unpaid internships, gig economy jobs. Now, Europe does not have a solution, Alan, and you're quite right, pointing to the disaster. And it's 12% roughly unemployment in Europe, 25% in young people, and 60-70% for young people in Spain. Europe is a failure in that respect and getting worse. And all the stuff you said, quite right. The question then comes is the UK having gone out, does it have a solution to those factors, which I think are going to lead to a great collapse? And what we have in the government is a government which basically is trying to, or will be trying to introduce Singapore on Thames, which will mean temporary jobs.
They're quite prosperous in Singapore, aren't they?
Well, the rich are very, very prosperous, and they have secure living conditions, the rest of it. But I'm not quite sure that's the model. And if that is the model, let them say so and see what the British public then think.
Well, in a way, this contradicts Alan's point. Alan rather airily, I thought, dismissed Germany's preoccupation with exports, like there's something bad about wanting your country to be exporting. Which is it? Is Britain going to be a more powerful capitalist state outside of the EU? Or is it going, as Alan, I thought, hinted, to be a rather newly muscular foreign policy actor?
We will be outside, and we will be essentially crushed in the relations with America. The Europeans, with whom we do nearly half our trade, they'll get a chance, they'll crush us. And at the back of the dream, and I can understand its emotional reasons, is of course the idea that we were the British Empire in charge and we can set up the British Empire again, with Japan, Australia, New Zealand. I doubt the rosy view of Alan.
No, it is.
You're not an optimist. Shabbir Razvi is an economist and a political analyst, and therefore, of course, perfect for this discussion. British, of course, but originally from elsewhere. How do you see this dichotomy that emerged, I think, in the discussion of our two professors?
British with a better suntan, I would say. So, look, as far as I'm concerned, the situation is whether Britain is in or out. It's really quite immaterial. I think it's for emotional reasons or whatever reasons that people voted to remain, to exit, and those who wanted to remain were looking at more numbers, more sort of economic issues, and they were not able to sell that concept. So I don't want to go over that. That's old chestnut as far as I'm concerned. As you said in your opening comment, it's done and dusted. No one is going to have a debate. What we've got to look at is the whole neoliberal economic model completely failing, whether it's in UK or the European Union or the United States. And I think that's the sort of fundamental question that we should be looking at. There was a recent article in The Guardian by George Mobion, whom I think all of you know very well. He's an economist and a writer, and he sort of, really quite interestingly pointed out that London is probably the premier capital for money laundering. And we have sort of, all kinds of Financial Conduct Authority, the AML regulations, and all kinds of things. But, if you've got a huge amount of money in your suitcase, you come here and you can get, an entrepreneur visa in UK, golden carpet, and sort of all kinds of instruments are facilitated for the rich and wealthy to come. If that's the route that Britain is taking, whether it becomes Singapore or whatever you like to call it, the issue is that the disparities that we have created between what Professor Rodney was alluding to is between the rich and the poor. Are they going to become more significant by us being out of it or in? As I said, the whole model, the neoliberal model, is failing, whether the European Central Bank or the Bank of England does quantitative easing over the last 10 years. That hasn't helped. And certainly the amount of money that has been printed in the last 6 months, the helicopter money that has been given to people, that's going to also create a problem after October, November, whenever it happens. So there are more fundamental issues.
Yes, but fundamentally, we now have the power, if we wanted to, I don't think we do, there's not a majority for it, but if we wanted to, ditch the neoliberal model, we now have the power as an independent country to do so. The European Union, if you're in it, you have no power to you're in fact constitutionally required to pursue neoliberal economics.
But George, we started that with Margaret Thatcher. 40 years ago in UK, the whole neoliberal model.
But if you make me the Prime Minister, we'll ditch it.
I would love
and
it.
and we'll have the power to do so.
Yeah, but the reality is that the City of London and as I said, the whole manner in which that money lands in London is tainted money. It's corrupt money. We talk about corruption and, the list of every year, the annual list is published of corrupt nations and so on. Yes, Africa, Asian countries, India, whatever may be deemed to be corrupt. But the corruption in UK is quite insipid. I mean, just to give you an example, what's been happening during the corona crisis, contracts of billions and billions of pounds
Hundreds of billions.
Are being given to friends of the Conservative Party without any oversight, without any transparency.
No tender.
No tender. So, if that is the route we are taking, and that is through having a majority of 80 in Parliament, just imagine if there was a majority of 120.
Even worse, the contracts haven't even worked. Let's go. We're surrounded by economists. Let's go to Thailand and talk to the rock and roll economist, Professor Steve Keen, an Australian, but an honorary professor at UCL in London. Professor Steve, is Britain capable of dealing with the impact of COVID-19 and leaving the European Union at the same time?
No way. It's not capable of coping with either, I'm afraid. I actually probably voted for Brexit, but mainly as a protest against the European Union. It's been obvious as time's gone on that like many people, I underestimated the importance of the Irish border. And in many ways, given that unique situation, that really made Brexit a bad idea, even if the European Union was also a bad idea. And its handling of COVID has been tragic. That's one reason I don't live in the country anymore.
Can Britain maintain the integrity of the Irish agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, and strike a deal by the end of the year?
You would take an incredible level of goodwill on both sides, and I think that's been lacking on both sides. The Europeans never wanted anybody to leave the European Union, so they were doing everything they could to block the British. And the British have been quite arrogant in the other direction and incompetent as well. So I think if there had been, for example, an agreement that all goods coming into Britain from the European Union are treated identically. I mean, it's always been difficult, and I don't know how many people listening have actually been to Northern Ireland, but the extent to which that place is still a powder keg is quite scary, and anything that would jeopardise it would potentially lead to a return to the Troubles. And on that basis, it would have taken the wisdom of Solomon to work out a scheme which would avoid it. And we've had the stupidity of the Tories instead putting this all together. So it was always going to be a mess. And my feeling would be the best thing would be just to forget about Brexit. Can it stay in the European Union with the current arrangements? And then try as best as they can to cope with COVID, which really is the most serious challenge that Britain faces right now.
Does Britain have to bypass or even just completely ignore the withdrawal agreement if we're going to get out by the end of this year?
It needed some overall agreement, but it also needed all the physical facilities, and this is the difficult thing. If you are going to become a separate trade unit, then you do have to have separate trade rules. I thought what would happen would be that Britain would completely adopt the European standards initially and then slowly work out its own over time, so that whatever was approved as a good for export from the European Union was exported, would be approved for import into the UK, and you had effectively the same, no tariffs between the UK and Britain. Not that tariffs are particularly important anymore, they're trivial compared to the levels they were 30 years ago. But none of that has happened. None of the preparations have been done to enable inspection of goods on the way into the UK. Nothing has been done in a treaty sense to say that we accept any European inspection as being equivalent to a British one. So it's just the sheer incompetence, really, that has made this doubly bad. And of course, incompetence is the rule all the way through, because when the Tories first pulled the poll on Brexit, they thought it would lose.
I mean, there's a necessary amount of uncertainty comes from a big change in a country's direction like this one. But do you think that the COVID-19 impact will make it more difficult to manage?
I think it will. I mean, for a start, one of the weaknesses that the COVID is pointing out is countries that let their manufacturing sector decline, because at the moment international trade has plunged for lack of demand, but we also have these extremely long supply chains which effectively transmit something like a virus very effectively. And with this disruption to those supply chains, you want to have as much manufacturing as you can locally to enable you to not be cut off from, for example, things like face masks and ventilators and oxygen generators, none of which I believe Britain could make when the pandemic first hit, and none of which they could import because any country that could make it was keeping it for its own citizens. That because ever since Maggie Thatcher, the UK has tried to make itself into a service specialist economy and ignored manufacturing, let it run down. It's got effectively half the manufacturing capability it had 30 years ago, and now it needs to double that capability once more. And it's very easy to destroy manufacturing capability. It's very hard to build it up.
Professor Allen, there is a Brexiteer who hath repented. He raised a number of issues, of course, but perhaps the one that lies behind this repentance is seeing Boris Johnson up close and personal. A lot of people in Britain don't have confidence that he can get Britain through Brexit and COVID at the same time.
Well, I mean, I'm not a member of the Conservative Party, and I never have been, and I'm not going to say anything in defending it. But I don't particularly have much to say in way of praise of the government's handling of COVID. On the other hand, whatever you say about the government, the end result has been that we're not in a particularly worse situation than other countries in Western Europe. In fact, we're in a better situation than France or Spain. And as far as I can see, the cost of all this, I was reading, I'm not a Guardianista, I never believe anything I read in The Guardian, and I'm certainly not a socialist like you, George, and I do believe in neoliberalism, and I do actually remember Mrs. Thatcher, whom I admired. But as far as from the Telegraph, and perhaps using different statistics, Britain will emerge from all this as a country in the G7 with the second lowest debt ratio to GDP. So I don't think I agree with the idea that it's all been a disaster. Can I come back also to something that was said about this nonsense about Britain losing a reputation about breach of international law? The WTO more or less exists all the time dealing with breaches of international law. That's what it's there for. And Chancellor Helmut Schmidt of Germany admitted that in 1973, when the Deutschmark became a floating currency, Germany had broken all sorts of international law, and he had a Latin phrase for it, not pacta sunt servanda, but his phrase was causula rebus sic instantibus, which meant that when treaties are no longer appropriate, you don't have to stick by them.
Well, there you go. There's the new British nostrum. Much more of this after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television. Coming from London and looking at the double whammy that Britain faces over the next few months. Dealing with the coronavirus re-spike because numbers have started to double every week. Again, whether that will have the same kind of death rate, hospitalization rate, we don't yet know. But on top of the struggle to contain the coronavirus, Britain is finally leaving the European Union at the end of this year. Let's hear from David Hennig from London, who's director of the UK Trade Policy Project and the European Centre for International Political Economy.
Yeah.
In your view, David, what is the current situation with regards to trade. Can you paint a picture for us?
Well, the situation is that the UK and EU were already trying to do a trade deal in record time. We do not see normally trade deals completed in a matter of months. These take years. What is the fact is that we don't seem to be particularly close to a deal between the two. And at the end of the year, the UK will leave the EU's customs and regulatory areas. And if there is no deal, there will be considerable number of barriers to trade both for people working between the EU and the UK, to goods being transported, completely different to the situation today.
As an expert on international trade, what is your view of the impact of Brexit on the British economy, and perhaps in particular manufacturing?
It will hit trade. There is no doubt that you put more barriers in the way of trade between countries, and it does affect them. And I give an example of the car industry. You have major car manufacturers in the UK. You have Nissan, you have Toyota, you have Jaguar Land Rover. Some of these companies are saying it will just not be economic for us to manufacture in the United Kingdom in the event that there are tariffs between the United Kingdom and the European Union. You have total integration at the moment between the UK and the EU. You have virtually no barriers to trade. You have goods coming in, leaving all the time, no checks. You suddenly put checks in, you put tariffs in, you put a lot of paperwork in. Some people's business becomes unviable the way it is. That must have an economic impact.
How can we reach an agreement with the EU in a way that complies with our international obligations over Ireland or other things?
International treaties always rely on a little bit of ambiguity. They don't lay down absolutely everything that is happening. If you look at the Good Friday Agreement, you'll be surprised at how little that actually lays down of what has happened since. It lays down some principles. It does not go into huge detail. And even trade agreements that have 1,000 pages, those 1,000 pages are not your manual for how to trade between countries. They are just the broad rules for the trade. So ultimately, within the broad rules of the different agreements, you find consistencies. There really isn't a problem. This is well understood between countries. And part of what is happening here is the UK is not used to this. You have people in the UK saying, but it doesn't do this or it does do that. No, you put the treaties in place and then you find the space within which to operate, and you make sure you do it cleverly. And I think that the UK is just not used to this. We're new to the game of trade agreements. We're quite new to the international game. It's changed a lot since 1973 when we joined the EU. We need to get used to it again.
The Prime Minister has come up with the formulation that any breach in international law involved in our leaving the EU will be specific and time limited. It's quite an ingenious formulation on the face of it.
Frustration, I think, mostly. I think that the EU is a very annoying bloc to negotiate with. I used to negotiate, I used to be on the side of the EU when negotiating with the US. I got phone calls from the US, from very senior US negotiators almost every week saying, could you tell the EU to stop being so annoying? Well, no, I couldn't. And this is what I think is happening, is that the EU, their rules approach and their inflexibility has just annoyed too much Boris Johnson, who is not known for wanting to follow rules, and he's become very frustrated.
Can we leave Europe and comply with our international obligations?
We can be an independent country. We can sign treaties, and some of them will have some effects on the way we operate. But of course, the UK can be successfully independent. We're still a significant enough country, if not the status that we had in the 19th century. Yes, the UK can be a success outside of the EU, but not if we allow the EU to irritate us, not if we can't get over leaving the EU, not if we do silly things like threaten the international rule of law. You have to do this in a good way, and at the moment we're not doing this in a good way.
Professor Shakespeare, isn't this all just shadow boxing? Especially after coronavirus, it is not in the interests of the European Union economies to have a total breach with the British. Surely the pressure is on for a free trade deal by the end of the year, however difficult it is in the time available.
Well, yes, you're quite right. You're on 45 and 50% exports and imports, and they are our nearest neighbours, and there are all the individual companies and the relationships between people, and it's all there, and it I would have thought, would create some pressure to get a deal. But the trouble is whether this government really wants that. It seems to me that it's going the way of we're going out alone in the world, and we can take on everybody else again, and we can break treaties, and we can live a sort of fantasy world. So yes, there could be a deal, but this government may try effectively to torpedo it because it's living in some sort of fantasy land.
Shabbir, the role of Britain and the European Union in international affairs, how do you envisage that? For me, different from Alan in this, I see Britain's potential role as genuinely an independent one, as a peacemaker, as a centre of diplomacy, as a centre of statecraft, making automatic enemies of none, being predisposed towards friendship with all. Isn't that the kind of Britain that most people, particularly young people, would like to see in the wake of our departure?
Well, firstly, I would like to say, I think Disraeli quite pointedly sort of illustrated what British foreign policy should be. And he said, we have no permanent friends.
Sorry, that was Palmerston.
Was it Palmerston? My apologies. I always thought
it's a great quote, though. Go ahead with it.
It is a great quote, that we have no permanent friends. We have permanent interest. Therefore, if you start from that amoral approach or even an immoral approach about international relations, that we're only interested in our interests, then yes, Britain will do wonderfully well. But if we have any iota of moral fibre, then perhaps we have to evaluate who do we do trade with. And just to illustrate the sort of linkage that Britain had, or the power that perhaps derived from the European Union benefit, was the treaty with Iran, the nuclear treaty, which obviously included Britain, Germany, France, plus Russia, China and the USA. USA pulled out, tore the treaty. Britain is still continuing to support that particular treaty. Now, if Britain is completely out and independent, would it follow Washington also saying that they don't want to be part of that treaty? So that's one aspect on international relations, whether Britain will continue to have that much influence.
Do you feel then that Britain will become, dare I say, a poodle of the United States? Because if you were saying that, I would just say one word to you: Iraq. I'd say Tony Blair, George Bush. Why should Britain out of the EU be automatically more subservient to the United States?
No, I agree with you. That's why I started with my opening comments. In or out, whether at an economic level or at a political and international relations, Britain can be as devious as it has been in the past. And just to sort of comment on our professor's comment about the Telegraph, Dave Allen, I'm sure you remember, a great Irish comedian, he said those people who read the Daily Telegraph perhaps want Britain to be ruled the way it was in the 19th century. Oh. And we are not living in the 19th century.
Nobody's wanting to go back
no
to
one
the 19th
is living in the 19th century. We're in the 21st century. There are different powers. China is a strong power now, economic power, potentially could be militarily. Russia is playing its own role. Iran is an important, significant power in sort of the Middle East. And if Britain wants to be at loggerhead, yes, it's got sort of Middle Eastern sort of countries, the monarchies, the monarchies supporting Britain. But in West Asia, if really Britain wants to have any influence, it must have good relationship with Iran. And are they willing to do that without the diktat from Washington?
Well, let's hear from a philosopher, because we're drifting into philosophical territory. John McCone is author of Philosophical Method and is running the project of Philosophy for the Future. John, thanks for joining us. It's a philosophical question right up your street. Does Britain have the determination to go through with this by the end of the year?
I doubt they had the time to negotiate a deal with Britain, and the simplest thing to do is to extend the existing status quo. That's probably something that can be done without too much negotiations. Whereas anything else will take a huge amount of negotiations and a huge amount of time. And I don't think the EU want to spend the time doing that. And I don't think Britain want to spend the time doing that. Right now, we're essentially we're engaging in a balancing act of balancing the economy with keeping the virus under control. The simplest thing to do is just to extend simply to extend the existing status quo. Anything else is much more complicated, and nobody has the bandwidth to deal with that. Nobody has the time or energy to deal with that, because everyone, all the politicians around the world are maxed out with COVID.
What would be the main impact on Britain of leaving the European Union without a deal?
Britain has recently had the worst GDP collapse in over a century as a result of COVID. And if we leave the EU without any deal, I imagine the GDP is going to go even lower than it is already. So it's just rubbing salt into the wound. I don't see. And the other thing is, Britain, that Britain will have to negotiate all these other deals with other countries, and none of the other countries have time either, because all the politicians are dealing with COVID as well. Like, America's on the verge of civil war. We've even alienated. I think we've alienated ourselves from China. There's a big argument over Huawei and the coronavirus pandemic and stuff like that. So there's not even a whole load of other great powers left to deal with on the international stage. So every single country in the world is now dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. Now is not the time to negotiate trade agreements with anyone, really. It's best to keep the existing status quo and deal with the pandemic.
Well, it's taken a long time, far too long, 4 years of uncertainty and political turbulence, troubled waters even. But we're almost there now. Where do you see Britain's future after we leave the European Union?
Political systems are composed of people, and people only have so much time and energy. I don't think the political system has the time or the energy to deal with Brexit right now. But the good news is, I don't think the EU has the time or the energy to deal with Brexit either.
Alan, these are last-ditch pro-EU arguments, aren't they? The last hope of the Remain faction in Britain is to postpone the final hurdle to some way down the road, when they hope, like Micawber, that something might turn up that can save the day for them. That notwithstanding, how do you deal with the point the philosopher made, that our economy is already 20% down? In fact, it's not the 100 years that he mentioned, it's ever. We have lost the biggest ever share of GDP. If you add a failure to agree a trade agreement with the EU to that, isn't that risky?
No, because it takes two to tango, and the EU is determined, as far as I could see, only to have an agreement if we're still going to act like a member state. Well, that's not going to happen. He's completely out of date. I mean, we've already put into law that we're going to leave at the end of this year. I mean, that can't be changed. It's not going to be changed. He doesn't understand that we've already agreed a trade deal with Japan. As for the great drop in GDP, well, yes, everybody in Western Europe had a great drop in GDP, some more than others. France and Spain about the same as us, but we've gone up again. We went down in the second quarter, we've gone up in the third quarter, we're expected to go up in the fourth quarter, so that 20% or whatever it was, 13% according to some, drop in GDP will actually be overcome probably by the end of the year.
Optimism there. What about you, Professor?
Well, yes, it gets down to optimism, or my own view is that the neoliberal model, which will be implemented, I suppose it gets down to one's long-term view as to the nature of the political animal. Yes, I can see that Johnson is trying to change that. I can see that. But look at the people who, in his own party, in a majority in their own party, and they are hardliners. They're going for the sort of Singapore on Thames, which I indicated early, and that
Tell
is
us
not
what that
a model.
would look
that
like.
is not, George, that is not a model for the future. And one quick word, when you mentioned about a possible future in which we are sort of a leader in peace, please remember we support Saudi Arabia, which is involved in a genocide in Yemen at this moment.
Sure, I know
don't
that.
want to know about this country being a leader in peace.
Well, no, but if we elect a government that is committed to that, we can now do it.
Okay. That is the other point where I do agree with you, is that once out, the chances of doing something differently, that I will concede.
I want you to describe what this Singapore on Thames, which is the great river running through the heart of London, would look like, and what's so terrible about it?
Well, it is this, is that roughly, if you look at who are the yellow vests in France, they are it's roughly 25% of the precariat. These are the insecure people with temporary jobs in the gig economy, and it is rising in all the economies, primarily because of the technological shift, which is computers and technology and machines and more automated production. And it's changing the nature of politics. And those insecurities and loss of real wealth and social position lie behind Trump's success in America. They very greatly lie behind Brexit, and they lie behind the yellow vests. Now, those things are going on. And I don't think, it's just my view, that I don't think that the present government has any knowledge or even understanding of this. They just assume we get out, we have a perfect model, and at the same time it will be addressing all these changes. But these changes are going on, and underneath them, I mentioned the debt, we are on the verge of a great big economic collapse. And when that happens, then we will have nothing.
All bets are off. Shabbir, let's do one last round of predictions. Let me make as the premise that there is a no-deal Brexit at the end of this year, that COVID continues and continues to alarm, but does not devastate the population to the extent the first wave did. Predict what happens then starting on January 1st.
Difficult question. I wish I had a crystal ball, and if I did, I could make a lot of money predicting what's likely to happen. So I will sort of postulate rather than predict. I think the situation is even more dramatic than what Rodney was talking about. And the factor that we haven't sort of put into the mix at this moment is the aging population in Western Europe, both in the UK and the European Union. In UK, the over 65 is, I think, 10.4 million at this moment, and it is predicted that for the economy to run efficiently, to be able to provide sufficient able-bodied people to work and pay the taxes, we need at least 4 million immigrants to come into the UK. The European Union needs 40 million new immigrants. Now, where are these immigrants going to come from? Are they going to come from...
There's no shortage of them, it doesn't seem.
No, there isn't, but we don't have the, because of the nationalistic approaches taking place that, all these brown-skinned people coming from the Middle East or the Polish who were working prior to Brexit and other European Union. So the reality is that forgetting about the gig economy and the other factors and the technology, which is going to create a huge burden. And what COVID has really done is expedited the movement of trying to rely on technology. As you know, even now, many people are working from home, whether it's in the financial service sector, the legal profession, the accountancy profession, and so on. A lot of them are working. This would have happened in the next 5 years, but it has triggered to a quicker pace. So how does that impact the economy and the well-being of the nation? And I think the key factor, as I said, is the aging population. And perhaps COVID may get rid of some of the older people because it tends to affect people like me who are over 65 more virulently than other people. So that may sort of help the exchequer if there are less old people. But the reality is that we really haven't thought a way out of how to sort of provide more taxes so that we can have the benefits of, pensions, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and so on. And that is the conundrum, I think, which I sort of predict that, come January 2022, we will really have to face in a big way.
Well, of course, when we're postulating, all of us are over 65, I think.
Yes.
Alan, you're the only one who might not be. That is the case whether we're in the European Union or not, of course. And Polish plumbers won't solve the problem of Europe's 40 million immigrants. We're not against immigrants. We just want proper immigration. We want to choose who comes into our country rather than who makes it across the channel in a rubber dinghy. Postulate, if you will, on my premise that we leave with no deal and that COVID, whilst bad, is not as devastating as it was feared it would be in the first phase.
No, I think we'll cope with COVID all right. I don't think there's going to be a second spike like the first one. About leaving without a no deal, I don't think it makes any difference because, after all, most world trade is carried out, as you said, without any free trade deals. We'd be trading on WTO terms. America, China, both trade with the EU on WTO terms. 80% of the world trades with each other on WTO terms. Our biggest companies today in Britain who trade with the rest of the world and not just with the EU already trade on WTO terms. So what does it matter? Tariffs don't matter. They're insignificant these days in size. And in any case, probably the pound would go down in value, which would more than compensate for any rise in tariffs. The thing that might matter would be special regulations, non-tariff barriers set up deliberately by the EU.
On standards, food standards,
Yes,
safety
on
standards and
what
so on.
have you. But we could probably negotiate with them even after next year. There's still a possibility, about a 50-50 chance that we'll get a deal. But in any case, it's not the end of the world. It's what most people do around the world when they trade. It's a natural, WTO rules, yes, you said without a free trade deal, are perfectly normal. Tariffs are quite low. They're averaging about 2 or 3%. And say that a drop in the pound would probably more than compensate for that. So I don't really see there's going to be a huge problem.
Professor Shakespeare, final word to you. Not having morbid fear is one thing. Insouciance is, of course, another. Is your academic colleague being complacent here, do you think? Are we in for a shuddering impact at the end of the year?
Not directly at the end of the year. I see the bigger global economic scene, and I don't think there is a solution. Very quickly, consumer standards, environmental standards and employment standards are one of the issues where I think there are forces within the Conservative Party which will want to lower those so to enable us to compete. And to answer your previous question, that is one of the Singapore-on-Thames aspects to it, I think. Whereas the EU is trying to hold us to their existing standards. And I think I'm right in saying that we are trying to break. Am I correct?
Yeah, but Britain has higher
standards.
Britain has higher standards than the EU.
Why do we want to stick with them?
Maternity provision.
Well,
we had all these things before we joined the EU. I can think of nothing that perhaps on the environment, but I can think of nothing that the EU gave us that we didn't have or wouldn't have had if we'd stayed out of the EU.
Well, I won't argue with you about it. I'll just reserve my position and say you could be right on that. I won't go that far, but I know that is one of the issues.
So we'll know soon enough, but not necessarily at the end of the year. It may take a longer time, you're saying. There'll not be a big change at the end of the year,
no.
but in the medium term,
it is
economic collapse.
Not at the end of the year, no.
So, George, can I just come in? Oxford Economics is saying that in a period of 10 years, if we come out without a deal, they're saying the GDP would collapse by 3.9% over 10 years. That's 0.3% a year. And they are probably pro-Remain. So the pro-Remainers are saying that over a decade, the effect might be 0.3%. And that's them being pessimistic. It doesn't.
Well, that's a price I'm prepared to pay for democratic control over our own country. But we're not all going to agree on this, and the subject will, of course, run and run. Thank you for joining us. I've been George Galloway. This is Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television.